So I am super excited to be here today with Dawn Dancing Otter. Dawn is a mother, scholar, writer, poet, storyteller, sacred rites and psychedelic ceremonialist, healer, crone, and activist. She is an internationally recognized teacher of ceremonial arts. So welcome, Dawn. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you, Josia. It's a pleasure.
So the first thing I'd love to ask you about, I'm just so curious about your name. Is that were you born with that name? Is it a given name from your parents, or where does that come from?
Oh, it is not my birth name. It was a name that was given to me by, so there's a story to this, but it was given to me by one of my first spiritual animism teachers. And what happened in that exchange was that, and the first time that I saw him, I was actually really sick. I had um, a, a, a really severe blood disease, um, and I was really scared. It was like a kind of one of those scary moments. I was only 28 years old, and I had just had a child, and so there was this very doom and gloom kind of experience
Wow.
happen. And my naturopath sent me to see Manfred, kind of because I didn't have a lot of options that were going to work really quickly, and she had a lot of faith in him. And I, having been like this kind of like wildly psychic person since a very young age, had kind of learned to be very skeptical because people were always really skeptical about me. So I was like, sure, that's going to help me. Because Manfred he's not with us anymore, what could be described as shamanic healing medicine. And um, I got in to see him really quickly because of a cancellation that was unexpected. He was booked up like 4 months in advance. And I arrived at his house, and he was in Cochrane, or just outside of Cochrane, Alberta, and his healing space is like covered in bison skins.
Mm.
And it was like a really powerful experience just walking into the room. But after he journeyed for me, he said to me, and I had explained to him in this kind of like conversation we had before the journey, that I really, was feeling like I wasn't free anymore, and that I had taken on too much, and that I felt, you know, like I'd lost myself. And when he came out of the journey, he asked me, um, he asked me about my favorite animals, and I'd said, well, my first favorite animal is the horse, definitely.
Mm.
And I really like relate to the horse. And he said, what do you love so much about horses? And I said, well, like they're really strong and beautiful and powerful, and they're free. They just sort of like claim that free space. And he said, yeah, and they're also like really capable of work, like they've been harnessed for that purpose and domesticated for that purpose. And I said, yeah, I get that. But I was also really irritated because it was sort of like he was coming to a point. And those who knew Manfred will know that when he came to a point, it was a really like quite a piercing experience.
Right.
And
Mm.
he looked at me with these really like penetrative eyes, and he said, Dawn, that's the whole reason you're sick. You don't know why you're here. You don't know what you're good for.
Mm.
You don't
Mm.
know what your purpose is.
Mm. Wow.
And I was like,
Mm.
wow, yeah, that's true. And I had a moment where I just received that and just knew it was probably the truest thing that I'd heard someone say to me, or like that anyone had bothered saying to me. It's sort of like one of those moments that happen in life where somebody takes you aside and goes, look, we're not fucking around with you anymore.
Yeah.
you know
Yeah. It's
and
truth. Yeah.
Yeah, it was really truthful.
Yeah.
Excuse me if the F-bomb is not
Oh
welcome
no,
here.
we use it all the time around here.
Um, Simply, well, I use it all the time too, which is kind of maybe not great,
Mm,
um, but yeah. Anyway, I received from him. He said to me, "You know, you're really like your soul is like this dancing otter. You're very, very playful. You don't even know actually know how playful you are."
mm,
When he was talking to me about that, something kind of fell away because I do remember being like that at some point in my earlier life. But
mm,
I had really set that aside because it's just like anything, who you really are when you're not being acknowledged or seen or validated, you often like set yourself aside in order to survive that because that's like a devastating blow to
yeah.
not be seen. And there was this kind of sensation, even though, the people around me when I was younger all had senses of humor. Like I grew up with a lot of humor, a lot of laughter, and a lot of storytelling. But there was this sense of severity, like I needed to somehow take it all real seriously. And that being playful was for, um, people who were not meant for something important, you know? And so it was almost like I had to choose between being, you know, taken seriously or playing. And actually, like
Mm,
that moment in Manfred's, um, in his space, what
mm,
happened for me was just recognizing there was this big wall that I had inside of me between who I really was and who I was meant to be,
mm.
and also who I had constructed. Uh, and that constructed place was really about surviving, not being understood.
Mm,
And so this is it's a powerful story, but there was a really big dent in that wall when I left that space that day. Um, and then I begged Manfred to take me on as a student. Uh, Later on, when I was starting to heal, when I was starting to get my energy back, I asked him to be my teacher, and he turned me down 3 times, which is actually like a proper way of doing things, I think.
mm.
Um,
Yeah, totally. I've heard that.
it's sort of like when people want to work with me, I try and talk them out of it first because um, I think that's proper. You should. I don't think people should be too eager to do something that's really life changing.
Mm,
um, and or they should really know what it is they're getting into in some ways.
yeah,
Uh, and
reasons why not.
right, uh, so the third time he said yes, and we started a really intensive apprenticeship process, which was sort of like Karate Kid, Mr. Miyagi, Daniel-san kind of experience, where I did lots of
Wow.
work work on his tree farm in exchange for learning things. And that was a really powerful time of my life. And um, he started to call me Otter instead of calling me Dawn, and that just sort of caught on.
Mm,
And so my clients started referring to me as Dancing Otter instead of Dawn, or my last name at the time was Weber. That was my married name.
mm,
And I I identified, I think for the first time identified, you know? It's like I'd been seen by somebody in the right context. And so I applied to change my name, and I have only ever gone by Dawn Dancing Otter since, the early 2000s.
mm.
Um, so that's on all of my ID and everything, which gives, customs officials a good laugh, and always, brings questions like this one.
Yeah.
Uh, and then I have to pause and tell the story, and it's good because then I remember Manfred, and I also remember to say Manfred Lucas's name,
Mm,
and because he has been a huge guide in my life, and even from his place beyond this world, wherever he is wandering, he is still guiding me. So,
yeah. Wow, thank you for sharing that story. That's really, really powerful. And I
Mm.
bet, I feel like that's such a thing in our society, is that not being seen, right? Not being seen. And,
Oh man, where do I start with that?
mhm,
Because actually, it's an enormous theme in the book, in my book that
mm,
I've written about.
mm,
Um, that there is this elemental need actually to not only be seen and recognized, and named and claimed
mm,
by the people in your world,
mm,
but to have the opposite experience, to be invalidated or um, ghosted or
mm,
pushed out or forgotten or made fun of, or not made fun of in like a playful take the piss kind of way, but I mean like somebody
harshly.
somebody making a joke out of you in a really mean-spirited way.
Mm.
Um,
Wow. So you're saying both those things are necessary, to be seen and to not be seen.
no, I'm saying the not be seen part
Right.
is so damaging
Okay.
because to not be seen is like
Mm,
it's a you won't survive that. You,
mm,
you won't survive that because we're here actually,
mm,
weaving each other.
mm,
And whether you're talking about your family weaving with you, or your friends, or your coworkers, or your elders, or whoever you're talking about, we're all weaving in each other, and this requires acknowledgement, and that acknowledgement, that validation. The moment that we start invalidating people, we're pulling them out of the weave, and that's a life-threatening circumstance. It's life-threatening no matter what time of life you're in. You might survive it a little easier later on in life, but early on, it's
mm,
a desperate thing to do to a child,
mm,
and um, it's a desperate thing to do to anyone. And
mm,
one of the things that I notice that we do, like in our very casual way of knowing each other
yeah,
uh, through our weird, like pictured, videoed Instagram lives,
yeah.
is that the moment we find ourselves not or disagreeing or not liking something,
Mm,
um,
mm,
or feeling some confrontation or some conflict, what
mm.
we do is we block that person. We like ghost them,
Right.
right?
Mhm,
Which is not the same thing as canceling. We can talk about that as a separate category, but I'm talking about ghosting someone, like where they no longer exist.
mhm. Okay.
And when that's come in because of something that wasn't abusive, like let's also name that. If somebody has been abusive towards you, you have every right to do that, but
Yeah.
if it's
Mm,
not come because of abuse, it's just like say disagreement, or
right.
you whatever, you
Yeah.
know. You don't
Yeah.
like you don't like you don't like their fashion or whatever.
Mhm, mhm,
Those things actually impact us in a way in a spiritual way.
mhm, mhm,
And we're so often confronted by this.
mhm,
Like I even notice it, I have lots of conversations with my students about this. I'm like, whatever happens when you're in conflict, there is a moment by which you can start working with it where you aren't so needing space.
yeah.
You
Yeah.
start working with it. What happens then is the weave strengthens, you get
Mm,
stronger
mhm,
together.
mhm.
But if you ghost that person, they will never understand.
Yeah. Yeah.
They won't get what you needed. Like there's no way for that to create growth.
Yeah.
It's
Exactly.
like just a damage that happens, and it
Mhm,
takes people a long time to heal from that. So,
mhm, mhm. Yeah.
and people do it all the time.
Yeah. Well, and you're making me think of like on the opposite end of the spectrum too, like how, like social media is like, it's like you get so many likes on your whatever, you show yourself, and then like the number of likes that you get on the post can like that does this dopamine thing to our brains, right? But then actually the social media platform is controlling the algorithm of what gets seen and what doesn't.
Yes.
Like pretty intense to think about from that perspective of like how it's affecting our neurocircuitry and our weaving into the world.
Yeah, and it can give people a false sense of self, like um it's a real tricky, I mean, this is a big subject, but like for people who have, body image issues, and I'll just own the fact that like that's me, I I know at almost 53 years old that um you know I don't have this same kind of niche factor as a lot of younger women who are doing some of the same work and putting that out there in this very sort of visual way that is,
Mm.
let's say, more aesthetically fashionable than a middle-aged woman
I don't
kind
know,
of.
you look pretty hot in some of your photos.
I'm also just acknowledging I
Yeah.
feel like I'm pretty good. Like I'm not in any way sort of disparaging towards myself. But I'm
Mhm.
also 53, right?
Yeah, I
So
hear you.
my
Mhm.
awareness is that I'm 53.
Right.
And so I also like just I'm at a stage where I don't give a fuck about what that translates for someone else. I feel like that's fine and that's good enough, right? Um, and I also know that I'm not competing, like I'm not in this competition
Yeah.
with people who are presenting an image in this sort of divine feminine goddess kind of sphere.
Yeah.
um, that's very kind of aesthetically visual, or like is very much about kind of that factor. I'm not
Yeah,
competing.
and like the youth, which is what is like favored in our society, right? Is that youthful kind of certain look. So that might is that kind of what you're saying? So that might get more that'll get more feedback, but it's not necessarily in more in alignment or in integrity, has more integrity to it. In fact, it probably has less because when we're younger, we don't know as much. We don't have that crone wisdom, that eldership.
Yeah, right, Josia. Like, do you think about being 30? Like you're however old you are now. I'm 53 almost. I
Mhm.
think about when I was 30 and just like how little traction I really had
Yeah.
in some of these really, really dicey spaces like grief and death, and
Yeah.
uh, also like really in animism, like really understanding. I mean, the little you can understand as a human being, what
Mhm.
it is to be a creator in this space,
Mhm.
And uh,
Mhm.
at
Mhm.
30, I didn't know shit,
Yeah, exactly. Right. Yeah,
And
and
that's
it's not, I
okay.
think it's not to
Have
say that
to.
people shouldn't be like putting themselves out there and trying and like offering their gifts at that point, but also to like wouldn't it be cool to have an algorithm that prioritized eldership? Like that would be
But
something.
also, I just think, the metabolism people have for wherever they're at is going to match up with the people who can metabolize whatever it is they're offering. And
Yeah.
so I'm also okay. And I'm not trying to put myself above. I'm just saying it's just a different palette.
Mm.
Like when you start working with the dead or dying or dead folk or like grief, or you're starting to work in places where people don't like to walk,
Mhm.
when you're starting to work in like trauma and PTSD and shit like that,
Yeah.
you basically you need to have this kind of earthier uh, space of
Mhm.
being, in the discomfort of what it is to be human.
Mhm.
And that takes a different metabolism. Those teachings aren't metabolized in the same way, and I mean no disrespect to people who are like talking about whatever they're talking about, but
Mhm.
I don't think that you can talk about like what happens for people when they're healing from like cycles of complex PTSD over decades and decades and decades, and compare that to somebody who wants to have like a kind of a um a high impact kind of transformational experience from like a, you know, a breathwork class, you know, like I don't think that you can compare those as metabolically similar.
Right. Yeah.
Um,
Mm. Mm.
yeah.
Yeah, exactly. No, that makes sense. Yeah. Yeah. And so grief, I want to talk to you more about this, certainly, because you've just finished writing your master's thesis on
Mhm.
grief ritual, which is
Yes.
amazing. And I'm curious about like, I want to ask you so many things about this, but maybe the first question is like, what what drew you? I mean, obviously your experience with Manfred and your health and like that recovery, I think that's a huge initiation, clearly. But what specifically drew you to wanting to hold space for the grief and trauma of other people?
It pulled me right in, to be frank. I mean, I am that playful person, you know. It's really hard for me to take a lot of things seriously. It really, like, it's work to try and take a lot of things seriously for me.
Mm,
Um, but I wonder if that is just a good reflection. When I work with people in the grief sphere,
mm,
um, I I I don't really struggle with taking it on, you
mm,
know.
mm,
Um, what I do know is that there is stuff at play
mm,
in grief, and actually, when people are really like messed up and aggressive and, you know, anxious and all of those kinds of things,
mm.
there's grief at play as well in there.
Yeah.
Um, but I
Mm,
would say that one of the things that prepared me to work in that space was the fact that I've spent all this time invested in discovering that playful part of myself
mm,
that is actually like quite innocent but also mischievous, and uh,
mm.
that is quite pure.
Yeah.
And I think one of the things that I like to help people find is kind of both of those things. The part of us that's really like has invested a lot of time and energy and self into love and devotion, and, you know, and then therefore grief. And then the part of you that just knew nothing at all about that before, like the part that is actually like open to new discovery.
Mm,
Um, and how I view this is that, you know, in order to feel like you're always a complete person, but in order to really feel like you're a complete person, you kind of have to invite all of the discovery. And all of the discovery has grief there, but also a space where grief is like not there,
yeah.
you
Mm,
know?
mm.
And
Yeah.
so like, you know, for me, it's like not being so overly focused on like when I talk about grief ritual, it's like then also can we talk about the kind of energy that it takes to be in curiosity and adventure and newness and innocence and discovery.
Mm,
Because I think that one tends to, you know, balance with the other if they're given space. But if we spend too much time in kind of unresolved grief, it kills all this beautiful new energy. And if we put all of our eggs in the basket of like purity and
mm,
innocence and not knowing, it kind of kills the space for grief, right? So we kind of have to have both of these energies.
mm. Beautiful. I love that way of of describing it. Yeah, totally agree. Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah. And I love that you say that that's the foundation, is that, that joy and that playfulness and or like I don't know if this is the words you use, but like owning that first.
Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah.
I find that for me. Because
Mhm.
I actually think oddly, like I was born October 23rd, the 23rd hour, the 23rd minute, in this like real liminal space, right, of Samhain,
Yeah.
this like very kind of abrupt witching hour. And that time of year is really very grief laden. You
Yeah.
know, it's the thinning of the veils, and we're in this space of, you know, being present to our ancestors. And we're really in this space of like understanding that life is more than just what we see in front of us as a new discovery, that
Mhm.
it's actually come from many, many lives lived. And so born in the world like that, and I came in the world as my grandfather was leaving it, quite literally. My
Oh,
grandfather, my mom's dad, died within hours of my birth.
no way.
And
That's amazing. My son too. My son and my grandpa, same. That's wild.
right. And so I was born with a grieving mother,
Yeah. Mm. Wow.
uh, through the body of a grieving mother.
Wow.
And
Mm,
when I was younger, I didn't quite get
mm,
that wasn't about me,
mm,
like I didn't quite get it. And
mm,
I also didn't quite get that many of the things that were projected on me because of the experiences simultaneously happening, that
mm,
those weren't created by me, and but later on in life, understanding that sort of grief avatar
mm.
that I was as a baby
Yeah.
served me really well, because what's interesting is that people with grief will find me, and I don't have to go looking. Uh,
Mhm.
they come find me.
Yeah.
I am, I think, a good ally in that respect. I'm a good navigator and ally in that respect.
You understand it on a cellular level.
Yeah, yeah, without like being choked to death by it.
Uh-huh. Yeah, well, embodying that joy, that playfulness still. Yeah, yeah, amazing. Yeah, I just resonate so much with everything you're saying. That experience of, I think that's such a common experience for people being born into something that is not them, you know, and where we identify with it, we think it's us at first because we're not capable of identifying otherwise as babies, right? We just think everything's us.
Yeah, and it's interesting that we have to have it that way. Like we're set up for that to be true,
Mm,
right? Like I think about all the suffering, but also like once you start rescuing yourself from your suffering and like not taking all the stuff with you
mm,
at every turn of the spiral. Like
mm,
sometimes just going, you know what, I lived that long enough. Thank you very much. I'm going to leave that part behind. And letting yourself be free to explore, but also rescuing the beautiful gems of the things that you learn at every turn. Just go, that's good. I'm going to keep that piece.
mm,
Every time that you rescue yourself, every time you become more of a treasure. And
mm,
like this is one of the things that I think eldership is really gives us, if we recognize it. Eldership really gives us this opportunity.
mm,
That lots of people who've lived or have the opportunity to live many cycles and
mm,
who
mm,
possibly have rescued more of themselves than younger folk. And then when you rescue yourself that many times, you also start going, you know what? I got some good stuff here. I don't need to carry all this other stuff.
yeah,
Thank
beautiful.
you very much.
Yeah.
And then we become good guides for the younger folk, because they're still working out what they should carry and not carry, what they need on their journey, how to pack that backpack so that it's useful. Um, I know my backpack was probably like 100 pounds.
Oh
That
yeah, mine was heavy too. Yeah. That's for sure. Yeah. Yeah.
was younger. Yeah, so I mean no disrespect to the youngers. I know you got stuff going on.
Yeah. And that figuring out that sorting, it's kind of like the Baba Yaga, Vasilisa sorting the poppy seeds from the chaff, like that sorting process, right? It's not entirely us that does it in a way, I think, like it is, but it's also like we got to have some help in there for
Oh,
sure.
sure do. I mean, which one of us who becomes sort of like a community person who can be of service does that from a place of like, okay, I did all this shit myself. Like
Yes.
I just
I'm
stepped right in and I'm doing all this shit myself.
so
Like
amazing.
I don't actually know anybody
No.
who who got to that place on their own. And um, to be frank, I've also like gotten to that place because I've been in abusive and like coercive teaching styles as well. Like, I'm not saying that's good. Don't do it if you have the choice, but I've been involved in a couple like straight up culty situations
Yeah.
in my years of learning. And what I've discovered from that, again, the rescuing of these gems is like, what does it take to be a teacher where you're not overpowering somebody's will? Because,
Mhm.
you know, where you're honoring that person's like specialness,
Yeah.
like you're letting them see some of the things that could maybe be worked on. They
Mhm.
do it in a willing way rather than like in a coerced way.
Mhm.
And I
Mhm.
really learned that shit because, and I'm still learning it.
Yeah.
Um, because as a matter of fact, the harm that has happened in those kind of learning environments were
Mhm.
such good teachers to me because I never ever want to cause someone to feel that way. Like I never want to cause it. I never want to come to a place where somebody goes, I resign my will over to you. You
Yeah.
know better.
Mhm.
Like, it was turn people back to themselves, say, actually, you know better.
Yeah.
I'm happy to be here with you.
Mhm. Mhm.
Because, yeah, two sets of eyes, two sets of ears, two consciousness, divining this experience is amazing. But I'm turning you back towards yourself so that you choose what is right for you, and only you really know that.
Mhm.
Um, and I had teachers like that. I
Mhm.
also had teachers who were like, "You don't know shit. I know everything."
Right.
And that was something else. That was interesting kind of polarity.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, for sure. Well, and it's kind of like, it kind of makes me think of like the purpose of what Jung calls the predator of the psyche, right? And that like that part of us that it does have a purpose. We have to like tell it to fuck off, but it also does have a purpose in the sense of like getting us to tell it to fuck off is an important part of the process, right?
Yeah. And then our gut is actually incredibly wise. Like, I think
Mhm.
about all the times my gut was just like screaming, this is not good. Like my
Yeah.
gut going, this is terrible and bad. And
Yeah.
my brain going, you know what, gut? What the hell do you know?
Yeah. Damn brain.
What the hell do you
Why you
know?
do that, brain?
You give me cravings for fucking Ben and Jerry's at 2 a.m. What the fuck do you know? And then it's like, and then my gut going, actually, that's you, brain, that does that. I'm just down here living my best life. You
Mhm.
can knock on my door anytime, you
Mhm.
know? But yeah,
Mhm.
my gut is never wrong,
Yeah.
actually,
Yeah.
and most people's guts aren't wrong.
Yeah, exactly. I would say 100% of the time. I saw this art piece when I was like 18 and in college, art exhibit, and it just all it said was this picture, and then all it said was your intuition is always 100% correct. Yeah. That stuck with me. I was like, yeah, that is true, that is true. And I think if more people, particularly women, really knew that, I mean, all genders really, it's like we all got to trust our gut. But I do think that those of us who don't identify as like the more privileged uh, gender tend to culturally get like override ourselves more, perhaps.
Oh,
Um,
we police ourselves like
yeah,
immediately, right?
yeah,
We
yeah.
police ourselves immediately. It's like, and we police each other pretty immediately too. Like,
Mm,
who is that woman to be so intelligent, wise, and
yeah.
outspoken? Let's destroy her. And I also feel like um, that that way of thinking, it leaves the creative energy that is feminine, that receptive kind of creative energy open to whatever wants to, you know, program itself.
Right. Yeah.
Um, and that if we start to trust and that creative energy is really strong and potent, and it actually knows what it's looking for,
Mhm.
you know?
Mhm.
Like it knows what it's looking for. It actually like kind of calls for it.
Mhm.
And if we stop trying to like, create this like hierarchy of consciousness where, our intellect is telling us, no, you know what, like I know better than the part of you that is calling for what it's calling for. I know better.
Mhm.
Chances are, that part of you doesn't know better. It
Mhm.
knows something. And I think the hierarchy of service in consciousness needs to be kind of acknowledged in a correct way. That if you, just like parents, if you look at your parents instead of as controllers, looking at them as as serving the children's best interests at heart or best needs, you can start parenting yourself this way, where you're like, I'm not going to use my intellect to dominate my body. What I'm going to do instead is like serve the best needs of this body, using this intellect. Um, and this is another thing that I talk about in my book quite a bit, is this like kind of reversal of um, control ideas, because control is like kind of I wouldn't say it's the opposite of service, but it's like it's not the same thing as self-control, and it's not the same thing as discipline.
Mhm.
uh,
Mhm.
we need to learn those things, self-control and discipline.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh. So when you're talking about control, is it like I kind of feel like it's this kind it's like a coming over overriding. Is it, can you just say a bit more about like differentiating between self-control and discipline and the type of control that you're talking about?
Yeah, like I
Mm.
think that the kind of control I'm talking about is like coercion, you
Right.
know like, and
Mm.
actually coming back to what we were just saying about, women, or feminine bodies or femme bodies feeling this sense of control over them,
Mhm.
so that their creative energy is really usurped. It's
Mhm.
like that for anything that is considered to be a lesser than being, like a child,
Mhm.
or somebody who's impoverished, or somebody who is not intelligent.
Mhm.
These kinds of things, are these kinds of classisms tend to create the opportunities for people to control, be coercive.
Yeah.
And that is the opposite of really teaching somebody something. And to be in self control is to know that there's wisdom in every being, and that actually to recognize you don't understand.
Mhm.
Like,
Mhm.
I say that, I say this to all of my students. There's really two fundamental things you need to understand about yourself. Two. There are other things too, but there are really two really important ones. The first one is you're very important.
Mhm.
Like, you're utterly vital.
Mhm.
The second thing is you don't know everything.
Mhm.
And that, you understand both of those things, that's a lot. But
Yeah.
to be controlling is to say, I know better than you something. And so your will has to bend to mine because I know better than you. And some people could argue, well, yeah, but like parents know that kids, when they run out into the middle of the street, this is always the thing that,
Right.
gets blah, blah,
Yeah.
blah.
Mhm.
And I'm like, yeah, I absolutely agree that there are moments where you need to make sure that your 4-year-old isn't getting smushed by a car.
Yeah.
But
It's
I
different.
think that's different. I think we can actually like agree that those moments are far less common than the moments that one has to spend in the discipline of teaching,
Mhm.
which is really like knowing that your child is going to ask you the same question
Mhm.
literally 80 times today.
Yeah.
And you have to have the self-discipline to answer it the same way every single time. You have to be the steady,
Yeah. Yeah.
and know that the child can always come to you and ask.
Mhm.
Because if you're the safe person that they can come to and ask, they will come to you,
Mhm.
right?
Mhm.
If
Mhm.
you're not a safe person to come to and ask, they're not going to ask you anything.
Mhm. Mhm. And share the stories, the same story over and over again too is often. similar. You know, my son used to say, "Mom, I have a question," and then he'd share a whole story.
Yeah.
It's like both, right? This like reflection, looking for that reflection back of who they are. And
Yeah. Yeah. The validation that they have internal intelligence,
mhm,
right? Like,
mhm,
and when I say intelligence, I'm really not talking about this. I mean like a soul intelligence. Like, if you're sitting with anybody, even if they don't speak your language, even if you don't understand each other in a verbal way,
mhm,
there's there is like deep intelligence on both ends. And you could say to yourself, I'm more skilled than this person. So if that's true and you're more skilled than that person, does it make sense for you to do the thing for them? Or does it make sense for you to share the moment of showing them? Because then the thing you know takes on life, right? It takes on life through other people. And you're not the like arbiter of that thing then, the only arbiter of that thing. And then it gets to take on life in other hands and other creativity. And like for me, I think the one thing that suffers when we think about controlling people versus having discipline and self control,
mhm,
is that when you have discipline and self-control, can you can say to someone, I don't have time in this moment to show you,
mhm,
but I see that you have this ability, this capability, and this interest. I don't have time to show you right now. Um, but
mhm,
you should learn that. Or I don't have time to do that right now,
mhm,
or we don't have time and I have the skill. So I'm going to do this thing, but I would really like you to watch me do it,
mhm, mhm,
right?
mhm, mhm.
Because what we need to recognize is that, the reason why a lot of us are kind of like orphans in our world, as Stephen Jenkinson might say,
Yeah.
is that we didn't used to mentor our children in this way, where we sent them off to school to learn things, and then they would come home and we would just sort of like uh, keep them overnight from dying.
Yeah.
We actually very, very consciously taught our children,
Mhm,
through not just reading and singing and storytelling, but also like,
mhm.
building things or adventuring.
Uh-huh.
Or
Yeah.
there's so many things that we used to do, and some people still do with their kids.
Mhm,
Um,
mhm.
but we're losing that in the general population.
Yeah. Yeah. And then just even like the being together, like the interface of like being together, doing things is getting lost. Like I have a teenage son who's 16. I know you have young men as well. And like the phone, right, is a new thing this generation. And the last couple of weeks we've taken away his phone for various reasons that I won't get into, but it's been amazing to see how much more it's like, oh, there you are. Like you want to hang out now. Every moment you're like following me around, like wanting to be connected, right? And it's like I think we start to tell ourselves like, oh, teenagers, they just like they want to disconnect and we think it's a natural thing, but it's not. Like I think that yeah,
It's
they want to
just
stay with
a
us, but
way,
there's a
it's just a way of dealing with the grief of not being seen,
right,
right?
right,
Like to
right.
just be like doing this thing is the grief of not being seen, and
Yeah.
like the
Mhm.
disconnect from it's just so much grief in that. When I
Mhm.
was in Ireland, actually, I was in Europe for the last month with
Mhm.
my lads. My younger is Ren, and Ren is identifies as non-binary,
Mhm.
and Ren is an artist, like has an artist being, and is 18, and they didn't have an opportunity to have a phone because I was the only one with like kind of a functional phone over there, unless there was Wi-Fi.
Right.
There often wasn't, because we were in spaces where we were doing ceremonies, so we were sort of like off grid, and So the amount of artwork that Ren did while we were away was phenomenal. And also like just the ability that both of my kids had to develop new relationships with these cultures and their lands and their languages and their foods and their ways, and just by being present and not disconnected.
Yeah, being there and sharing that culture and yeah,
Mm.
yeah, yeah. Wow.
It's powerful, right? It's real powerful. And again, I mean no disrespect to people who have kids who have phones. My kids both have phones,
Yeah.
and they're pretty much grown-ups. Like Ren is 18 and Gabriel is almost 25. But so they have their own lives in that way, but and they both have phones, but it's sort of like this recognition. Like I have a recognition that if I've been on my phone too much or I'm like on a computer too much, then I have to ask myself, what is it that I'm running from?
Right.
What feeling am I running from? And then sometimes it's just like rest.
Yeah. Yeah,
Like
totally. Yeah.
I'm
Yeah.
just running from this deep rest I need,
Mhm.
and
Yeah.
for some reason won't let myself have. Or
Mhm.
sometimes I'm running from confronting something that feels painful, or sometimes I'm running from some grievous feeling.
Mhm. Mhm.
Sometimes
Mhm.
I'm running from my sense of meaninglessness or mediocrity. Like
Right.
that's all chasing everybody all the time. It
Yeah.
chases me too.
Yeah.
Sometimes I'm like, what am I really doing here? And actually then, you know,
Mhm.
something will smack me right in the face.
Right. Reminder, wake up. I need your help.
And
Yeah.
but I also know like we all get, these are real feelings that we have, right? Like the real feelings of meaninglessness and listlessness and lack of purpose, and the grief that we have when people don't see us.
Yeah.
You know, like I remember when I was a kid, I used to get so freaked out when people would not understand me, like misunderstand me.
Mhm. Mhm. Mhm.
Like I would be trying so hard to communicate something. But
Yeah.
when you're a psychic kid, I mean, everyone thinks you're weird, right? But, just try and communicate something and then have that person deny that
Mhm.
what you've seen was seen, or that what you experienced was experienced, or that what you're even talking about makes sense. Like I remember being told, oh, you're telling tall tales, or you're making that up, or, those kinds of things. It would just be devastating, you
Yeah.
know?
Yeah. In that invalidation, right? Of art.
Invalidation.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
To be like, just be in the strength of like,
Yeah.
of allowing that we all have these feelings that come up and they're super like hard in the moments, and that instead of projecting them elsewhere or ignoring them, burying them, blipping them out, we can actually like just go, yeah, me too. I have that going on too.
Yeah, exactly. Like that acknowledgement of our common humanity, right? And I think like, yeah, because I mean, I think we can talk about, how we're all addicted to our phones and like, and there's grief underneath of that, but there's also this element of like, well, but what do we do? Because we're living in this structure where there's not really the support where we can just be like, oh, I'm grieving. Let me go to the fire where my community is sitting and share that, like most people don't have that available in this day and age, which I think is why work like what you and I do is so desperately needed. But
And also like while we can acknowledge that it hasn't disappeared.
mhm,
I used to hear it all the time when I was in Europe 20 what was it, 2014? Yeah, 2014, and I was being interviewed by Croatian TV news people because I was in Zagreb teaching, and no, I was in Bosnia. I was in Bosnia teaching, and I was being interviewed, and they were like, so tell me why what you're doing is even relevant nowadays, which is like a pretty big and also like appropriate question
yeah,
for someone in the Bosnian news to ask a Canadian woman, like, what the hell are you doing here in my country doing stuff?
yeah,
You
mhm,
know,
yeah,
um,
yeah,
That was pretty relevant. Uh,
Mhm, mhm.
but
But
it
also,
also,
there's also the context of like they don't get it, obviously, right?
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, it was also, and I just said, you know, we've had so many things stolen from us,
Yeah.
you know, we had so many things stolen from us. And the moment I said that, the woman just really like all the energy came out of her face. Like she wasn't kind of counting on that answer from me, you know. And I said, we've had so many things stolen from us that we couldn't even start to account for it, the things that have been stolen from for us. And I don't profess to fix any of it. What I do know is that for whatever reason, I was open to being this person who would carry this thing. And when I became open to that, the world started saying yes to me, because I said yes to that. And I can't explain to you if it's useful or meaningful in a deep way or even relevant. What I do know is that there are 80 people at this gathering. And uh,
So it must be relevant to them.
there's a
Yeah.
need, there's a need being filled here.
Mhm.
And I also just see like a lot of people are really awakening to their want or need or capacity to hold such space. Um, I'm always really speaking to the fact that it's actually just not easy.
Mhm.
You know, it's not just that easy to say you're going to do it. There has to be a tremendous amount of self work, and you have to just really stay present to the fact that it can so easily become control,
Uh-huh.
and it can so easily become out of control, and it
Yeah.
can so easily become just stuff that is wounding instead of actually helpful and healing. And um unless you're really on top of it.
Yeah.
And I speak to that from, you know, a lot of experience too, where just like I wasn't, you know, in the right way in that moment, and to be holding space
Mhm.
and learning that it's never worth it. It's never worth it to just kind of supersede the protocol of
Mhm.
personal work.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, when we're working in these vulnerable places, it's like such a huge responsibility. Yeah.
It's huge. Yeah. And like also like working with psychedelics, and I don't, I'm not sort of one of these big people that has a medical clinic. I am, you know, I'm like a little community person who helps people with psychedelic work, and I do it in a ceremonial way. I don't do it in a clinical way. I do it in a ceremonial way. There aren't that many of us, and that are doing it in this old way. And there's so much that can go wrong if you don't do it right. And if you're not really super present, if you're not really in the discipline of it, it is actually can be very disastrous.
Yeah.
And so, you know, for me, I just really feel like 90% of what I do, what I'm doing, when I'm doing, is actually self work. And
Uh-huh. 100%.
the 10% is stuff I'm doing with my community.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. No, I agree. I agree on that one. I've read somewhere, I forget where, but recently that the word psychedelic actually means to write on the psyche. And so when we're taking these medicines in, it's basically like opening up our whole psyche to be rewritten. And so I think people often think, oh, I'm going to take this plant medicine and it's going to heal me. And it's not the case, because it's like the context, the, you know, they say set and setting, the space that's being held, the nervous systems that we're with in that.
Yeah, there's a deep kind of triangulation happening, and I'm not using that in like a negative way, that that word is used in lots of other ways, but the person, the medicine, and the person who's holding the space are making this kind of like collective energy happen together, that will expose the nervous system to an earlier way of being, like as you were as a child, in this very open subconscious way. So your subconscious is completely wide open, And when you say write on the psyche, yes, you can, but you can also erase things.
Right.
And or not necessarily erase, you can contextualize, you can move things about.
Yeah.
But one of the things I like to say that's really powerful is that when you're working with psychedelics, you can expose an early trauma, and instead of not being met, and Gabor Mate says often that the major trauma for children is not that the thing happened. It was the fact that the thing happened and then they weren't met.
Yeah. How it was held. Yeah. Hmm.
Yeah, so it's how it's held, right? You surface the trauma, but then you're actually able to, as a ceremonialist, you're able to meet the person there. They're not alone.
Hmm. Hmm.
So that script gets rewritten
Yeah.
in a really powerful way. And it's not the same as so-called trip sitting, where you give someone a substance and a blindfold and music and just let them go.
Yeah.
That's okay too. That's a different experience. Um, but ceremonial work is very active. You're actually helping to meet people in these really delicate spaces. And yeah, you have to be real tuned in.
Yeah. And tuned into your own stuff coming up and getting in the way or interfering. Right.
You have to be real tuned in. And yeah, you have to know what you're doing. You also have to really be uh in this, really calm space, but at the same time you're planning for all the things that might need to happen in order to make sure that person's safe. All the things that might need to happen in case something comes up that you weren't expecting. And that, takes a person who is very dedicated, because that is not easy at all.
Such a dynamic space to be in. Yeah. So you have this background and training and deep connection to, I know, the ayahuasca world and some deep training there. And I would love to ask you more about that. But I think just because we have so little time left today, I want to go back to your own ancestral roots in Ireland. And because I know you've deeply studied Irish grief ritual and grief work. And I'm curious about one, like yeah, what led you there, and how you found, how available is that knowledge, those ways of knowing still, um, and just anything you want to say about that. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. That's you know, so much has been stolen from us, Irish folk, we had an entire spiritual foundation of our ways, of our agriculture, of our, like, of how we decided where people were living and how they were living, how we decided communities would develop. Like, this was a whole spiritual framework. And oftentimes people think about Ireland as being Celtic, and actually, our spirituality predates
The Celtic.
Celtic, the Celtic invasion. And I'm speaking right now, not to you, but like, I'm not in this moment, but like speaking right now to a historian who's working on a book about, questioning this whole like invasion of the Celts. This is like an aside, but his theory is actually that Ireland wasn't really invaded by the Celts, but that's something to share another time. I just think it's really interesting,
Yeah.
um, because everything is sort of attributed to the Celts, but we actually had a spirituality that exists that predates the Celts, and it also predates a lot of the things that we consider to be Celtic or European styles of spirituality. And a lot of things came from Ireland as opposed to came to Ireland
Mm.
around these practices of spirituality.
Mm.
And we've had to reconstruct a lot because so much has been stolen, because so much was made illegal.
Mm.
Um, a lot of things became relegated to the hands of women.
Mm. Mm.
They weren't always just in our hands. Like, we had male druids, we had female druids, we had two-spirited druids. Uh, but a lot of things became relegated to the hands of women because we really occupied the space of the home and the hearth and kitchen. So a lot of things that were witchy were really, sort of, became cooking.
Ah, uh-huh.
This is a lot of the ways that we transpired and allowed for an oral tradition to continue was
Mm,
was in the hearth spaces and the kitchens of a lot of women.
mm,
So we still have some of these traditions because we've had women who have continued them at risk of their own life.
yeah.
You know,
Mhm.
how did I learn this? I learned this way of relating to grief uh, in a couple of different ways through people, through teaching, through people that had spent a lot of time in the reconstructed teachings, really rescuing the things that were related back to our early lore in the oral tradition and that were present there. And then also we're reviving and keeping alive things that were helping people in real time here and now. And I also learned from the land itself and from the lore and
Mm.
from the songs and from, like Irish music is so damn melancholy. It's,
Yeah.
I mean, we're always talking about death or sex or both, you know?
What
Um,
could be more important?
or, I guess love, love, sex, death, yeah, those kinds of things. But yeah, Irish lore that exists is really powerful because it points us back in the direction of the fact that the grief has to be honored before any creation happens. This is in every story.
Mm,
So the reason why I pursued it, being a person of Irish descent, is that the other cultures that I'd studied with, um, I felt weren't enough for me to feel like I had come full circle in these teachings. Um, I've studied in South America, I've studied in Hawaii, I've studied in North America with Indigenous people. I've had lots of different teachings. I've also studied in Hungary, and I've studied in with teachers in England. I've studied with teachers in Scotland and Ireland. And for me, coming back to the Irish way, started to realize that a lot of things came from Ireland. People keep thinking that um, that stuff was brought there and this is where it was formulated. Everybody kind of shared things. And this teacher, a friend of mine who is doing this book, who's questioning whether the Celts really came, he said, I have a problem with this idea that everything came to Ireland and that's where it really took hold. They brought it. It's like,
right.
actually, it was here. And people came because it was here.
Mm,
I came because it was there.
mm,
Every time I go to Ireland, it is there.
mm,
When I step on the land, I am in a liminal space. It is like literally the edge between worlds. You can go places in Ireland and literally feel it. You feel it in the air and on the ground, the space between worlds. My friend Deirdre Murphy, whose parents own, her family, I should say, owns Murphy's Ice Cream, which, by the way, amazing ice cream.
In
Murphy,
Ireland?
Murphy's Ice Cream. If you're from Ireland, you know Murphy's Ice Cream. That Deirdre, my friend, said the elements here are a strange liminal space or mixture. So it is earth and water creating a third thing. It is air and water creating a third thing. So they have this bog and then they have this mist, you know? And I'm like, yeah, it's like this incredible, there's a lot of like, there's nothing really edged out. Everything's sort of collectively weaved in to
Mm,
that. Is
mm,
really powerful.
mm,
And for me, every time I go there, I learn something uh, earth shattering and
mm.
earth redefining.
Yeah.
Um, and why? Because it's hard to say why. Because, I think we all seek meaning, and I think we seek it out to the point where we feel that our soul is satisfied with the story that's being told us,
Mm,
you know,
mm,
so that we can go forward with our story and we can help people create with us. We can weave.
mm, mm.
I needed that for me,
Yeah.
and
Wow.
I needed that for my kids, you know. Hmm.
Wow. Beautiful. Inspiring. Yeah. Yeah.
And grief ritual there isn't so much a thing that's apart from other rites of passage, you
Mm,
know. I won't get into it too much. It's lots, but the most important feast in the wheel of the year, the feast, the eight feasts in Irish lore is Samhain, and Samhain is coming up right away here too. Samhain is the place of the ancestors. It's the thinning of the veils. It's a place of honoring what's come before us. Grief is actually part of the driving force of the wheel,
mhm.
energy of the wheel. If you don't start there, if you don't actually start your journey there in that Samhain place, your wheel is not moving, right? Because it's flat, it's not dimensional. So when we talk about grief ritual, we're really talking about Samhain.
Mm,
We're talking about our experience of Samhain when we are grieving something that we have lost or a person we have lost,
mm,
you
mm,
know. So we start with Samhain. What did you lose? And
mm.
also, what did you rescue?
Yeah. Yeah. So powerful. Yeah. A friend of mine recently has gone through a huge major loss and had previously been involved in a lot of rites of passage work. And what he said coming out or coming at, to the midpoint of this recent major loss is just like all that previous like rites of passage work, nothing, nothing compared to actually, when we're brought to our knees by real grief. There's
Mhm.
something there, I think, that's a critical initiation point. So it just, yeah, what you're saying makes so much sense. So you have this Wildwood Witch School,
Mhm.
and registration is open now, begins right after Samhain, right? Is it November 8th?
Yeah, it's still in that kind of gateway of Samhain beginning, and we run it to Imbolc, which is the beginning of, well, should be the end of January, but we run it to the beginning of January. So we're connecting those 2 points of grief and new beginnings,
Mm,
inspiration,
mm,
as we discussed earlier. Yeah, it's a so like I'm not a big fan of this whole online thing, right? Like I really like being in the room with people,
mm,
and not because it's selfish. Like I was just like, am I being selfish about this? No, because something happens in person that doesn't happen when you're online or you're on a screen. We all have to admit this.
yeah, 100%. 100%. Yeah.
Where something else happens and something else is possible when you're doing things online like this Wildwood Witch School is possible to do online. And I think possibly because most of it is kind of easily metabolized information
Mm,
for women and women identified folk to really take in,
mm,
and also to share. So we're not working really in the complexity of the kinds of ceremonies that you might do in grief ceremony, for example, or that I might do in grief ceremony, for example. There, there's more education about what it is to honor time and honor the feasts, honor the cycles, honor the rituals
mm,
that exist in those feasts and those cycles, and to remember some things that may have been forgotten somewhere in the cellular buzz. And also for it's a place where people where women identified folk come together, because really oftentimes the major healing factors is like, oh my god, I'm in a real safe space here. I could share, this thing, whatever this is that's going on, I could share it here.
yeah.
And we are so in need of that, because I don't know if you learned this during COVID the way I did, but what I learned during COVID is we have way more need for collective sharing than we have spaces to share.
Yeah. 100%. Yeah. Hmm.
A lot of that is allowing that sharing to happen. And I have two cohorts. One is in the morning, BC time, it's 10 a.m. And then I have one at 6:30 in the evening. And I did that so that people who were in England, I have lots of students in England and Ireland, I have lots of students in Europe, would have the opportunity to join us for those teachings because that's evening time for them. And
Hmm.
then I have another cohort at 6:30 in the evening for people in North America
And
to
that's
join.
Pacific time, 6:30 Pacific time. Yeah. Yeah. Mhm.
Mhm.
Yeah. And yeah, I mean, what really struck me about what you just said was, uh, actually, I can't remember your exact words, but something around like healing our relationship with time or
Yeah.
getting reconnected. And that, I mean, that feels so powerful in, because we're in this society, this colonial society that basically says that our time is what we're worth. Our time is our value, right?
Yep. It's kind of fucked.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
it's kind of fucked because it's like not only is time your value, but your status
Mhm.
associated with your time
Yeah.
is your value. And we used to, as humans, regard sacred timekeeping as incredibly powerful.
Mm.
If you look at every culture that practiced some version of animism practice, so now we're talking about the soul practice where we are acknowledging that the soul is animating the body. That's so that there is something spiritually animating the physical. And there are cultures around the world like this. They all have sacred timekeeping. If you look at every like stone circle in every cairn, every place in Europe that still exists, there is a time associated with that ceremony. There is a specific time associated with it where the light is shining through the stones in a certain way. If you go to Central America, any of the Mayan pyramids, there are places where the sun is meant to come through certain spaces at a certain time of the year. These are all methods of sacred timekeeping, and we used to know this well. Now we are not in natural law with our time, literally looking outside your window and noticing daybreak to dusk gives you a sense of time. So, right now, we're moving into our nature of rest in the Northlands,
Mhm.
where the people in the Southlands are starting to blossom. The people in the Northlands are starting to move into rest. This ebb and flow that is really associated with light and darkness and the movement of the moon, these things were deeply known unto us. And when we knew them well, we had a great deal more healthy respect for not just our work, but our lives and also the creaturehood around us. Like we used to have connection points to, when is it time for hunting? When is it time for gathering? When is it time for planting? When is it time for harvesting? We used to know these things. We didn't just have like go down to the store and get whatever's there. So these things that are natural, and I'm not trying to, point this out like we're doing something wrong, like anybody is responsible for that. Like
Mhm.
you aren't, I'm not. This is the world we were born into. And it bears knowing again. It bears remembering. Because when we remember that our relationship to time is sacred, we understand our life is sacred. Because your life here is this blink. It is a spark. It is a star, right? So when we're regarding that time is sacred, our relationship to time is sacred, we can also look to each other. This is also what produces so much more grief, really. This knowledge that it's so brief.
Yeah.
This moment that you and I have together, it's getting recorded. Anyone can pull it up 10 years from now. But you and I will have had it for a brief moment and then it's gone. And there's always tremendous celebration and tremendous grief in knowing that.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah, I can feel the wave of grief in that, and also in the, the how disconnected we are from that
Mhm.
as a society at this point, like how far we've gotten from that natural time and
I have real theories about this, and we can't get into it today. But I have books coming about this, about sacred timekeeping and actually like sacred timekeeping, meeting sacred geometry,
Mm,
uh, meeting early childhood trauma.
yeah,
And this is coming down the line,
let's
but
do another podcast.
another podcast.
Yeah, I feel you on that. Yes, this is a thing. There's a relationship, 100%. Yeah, yeah. Yeah. So the Wildwood Witch School, uh, those teachings that you're sharing, are those primarily coming, like in the school, are they primarily coming from the Irish lineage
Yes,
or yeah.
they're
Okay.
primarily Irish teachings. Yeah.
Yeah, beautiful.
And I mean, also, like, we keep it alive through ourselves. So, like, some stuff comes from my sensibility,
Mhm.
right? So I'm not actually just teaching by rote. Like, I'm not teaching just things that I was taught. It's these teachings are alive.
Yeah,
And
beautiful.
a lot of them are about sacred timekeeping, which is actually like that's transcultural,
Mhm.
pan-cultural. Yeah.
Beautiful. Great. And people can find that on your website, the
Yeah.
weaveworkschool.com.
.com. Yeah.
Yeah.
And they can just see under where it says teachings, there's a page for the Wildwood Witch School.
Okay, beautiful. Yeah. Anything else you want to share to wrap us up, wrap the bundle today? Mm.
Wow. I mean, there's so many things I
And we
could
could keep talking for like many more hours, I think. Yeah.
for part one, part two, part three.
Yeah.
Um, but first thing is I really appreciate you. I know that as I was saying, this work with grief is really profound and it's so needed, and I'm always really appreciative and welcoming of those in our community that are offering these containers and also teachings for people to tap back into understanding the grief process and this like sacred tending to grief. So I mean, I just really want to say thank you, and thank you for doing that work and continuing to do that work, and being a colleague in the community in that way, and teaching and being in that role. And the last thing I want to share is um, this is again another podcast, but it was just something that really stuck out to me. You know, there's what's sacred and there's what's consumer-based capitalism. And these two things are actually not the same. Um, and what is sacred is usually found in places where being a consumer is something we set aside. And what I'm aware of is that we're all trying desperately to try and create this kind of like crossover mishmash of those things. And what I understand now in my 50s is that as I focus on the sacred, the whole livelihood thing just really takes care of itself. Like I'm not focused on the money making part of it at all. I'm really focused on creating sacred spaces, or really like acknowledging sacred spaces and sacred time.
Mm,
So
mm,
that doesn't mean that I don't have bills to pay and stuff like that. But I just really want to invite people who are confused about that to really sit in the grief
mm.
of how hard that is,
Yeah.
and how much we're all sort of struggling with it.
Yeah. Yeah. Beautiful. No, I really appreciate that you bring that forward, because I think it's like, and yeah, that also doesn't mean that you don't charge for your work and that you don't charge well for it, and that you don't, right, like, correct, like it just means that the
I
focus is.
I have a relationship to that where I am very aware of what is reasonable,
Mhm.
because there is that. There's what is reasonable, and then there is what is actually punitive or unkind
Mm,
about imposing, on people that, I mean, I I just really feel it's a hard dance because you have to sit inside of what is reasonable for yourself and also other people. And that
yeah.
always means you're in a community way rather
Mm,
than in just a, I'm going to charge this because I this and me this. And it's like, actually, who are you in your community?
right. Yeah.
And so I'm really focused. Again, this is another book, but on these consequential conversations around sacredness and consumerism, and that I'm not interested in being a consumer-based product.
Yeah.
Because that wouldn't be fair. People would all get indigestion. A lot of
Yeah.
this stuff is a heady palate. People would just get indigestion. And so my feeling is I want to create space where people can develop their palates.
Mm.
And this is why I'm always in conversation with people around what's reasonable for them.
Uh-huh. 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 Yeah. Yeah, it's such a dance, isn't it? To try to be in like you said, this system, the society of, this capitalist consumerism, and to hold the sacred at the center. It's it's like ninja skills, I think.
It's ninja skills, and I mean, actually, it's far be it from me to know it. Like, I just don't.
Mhm.
I'm not in any sort of space of expertise around that. There are people out there that are doing lots of expert work in that way. But
Mhm.
I will say my heart is really in the conversation of what's reasonable.
Mhm.
And this is why I just feel like, you know, no matter if they're a student or a client or what have you, I've had lots of conversations with people about what's reasonable
Mhm.
for them. And
Mhm.
uh, I've gotten to know people that way. It's very vulnerable to have that conversation with someone, you know,
Yeah. Yeah.
and
Exactly.
I've had to have it many times in my life.
Yeah,
You
exactly. Yeah, and there's something to the power of like being willing to ask, being willing to ask when you need something, being willing to ask for it in a way that's reasonable to your own individual situation, right?
Takes a lot of bravery. It sure does. Yeah, it takes a lot of bravery.
Mm.
And also like helps you look at that too, with kindness, but also like with a discerning eye.
Uh-huh. Yeah, absolutely. Well, I feel like I said, we could probably keep talking for many more hours about all these things. And I know we're in this space of time, we're in this time, right? This time that we need to honor. So thank you so much for offering your time today.
Love you so much, just Josia. You're amazing, and I look forward to all the things that are you're putting out into the world, and
Mm.
blessings on your ventures.
Yeah, thank you. Same to you. Okay, thank you so much.